presentation at a Velocity Conf a couple weeks ago. Sean asked me if I would be willing to share it with you guys, so here I am. My name is Bethany Erskine. I work for Paperless Post. And I know I already asked you guys this once, but if anyone didn't get to set up the Sandbox, I have USB keys here. Does anyone need it? Okay, you guys are great. Okay. So, who all here actually likes their monitoring setup? Or is happy with their monitoring? Anyone? How many Nagios users do we have here? Okay. So we have any Sensu users? No? Okay, cool. So the reason I'm here today is because I actually like our monitoring setup. It hasn't always been this way. So my story is that in 2001, I joined Paperless Post as the second ever member of our ops team. We were a really small team and we had a lot of challenges, one of which was fixing our monitoring infrastructure. So what we had was a monolithic Nagios server with no version control, no configuration management, and every time we needed to add new hosts, services, checks, etc., we were just manually editing the files and restarting the Nagios server. And even though I had had years of experience configuring Nagios and could pretty much write configurations in my sleep, I really dreaded ever having to do it. So our metrics collection setup was in even worse shape. We had Munin deployed for a handful of servers, but it was really awkward to work with, and it had pretty much been abandoned. We were sending data directly to our Rails app, from our Rails app through StatC to Graphite, but we had no server system metrics to correlate with. So in the fall of 2012, we'd outgrown our old managed hosting service and had found a new provider, and we're making preparations to move our entire infrastructure to a new data center. So at this point, all of our infrastructure was managed by Chef, and our plan was to bring up the new data center infrastructure entirely using Chef and Knife and VMware. So we had an opportunity to start fresh and started exploring our options and quickly fell in love with Sensu. So why Sensu? So Sensu is Ruby, which we know and love at Paperless Post. And even though the Sensu components and server components are written in Ruby, the checks and plugins can actually be written in any language. There was already a fully fledged Chef recipe for Sensu. In fact, Sensu was designed from the ground up with configuration management in mind. We saw an opportunity to get involved with a young project that we could potentially contribute back to. And in fact, the Sensu Community Plugins project was my first real open source contributions. And after nearly 2 years living with Sensu, I still feel strongly enough about it to want to keep supporting it in any way I can, which is why I'm here today. Some other great things about Sensu, you can reuse your Nagios checks. So like in our situation, we were under a tight deadline. If we didn't have time to implement or write our own Sensu checks in Ruby, we could have just recycled the Nagios checks. All the metrics and checks are collected by one system. You don't have to have Munin here, Nagios here, and NRPE, etc. Sensu had documented Graphite integration, and it was purportedly easy to scale, which we ended up calling on later a lot. Sensu is an incredibly flexible tool. I've yet to come up with a device or situation that I couldn't somehow monitor with Sensu. It's sometimes referred to as a monitoring router, which I think is a really accurate description. It can handle any input and pass it off to any other script, system, or handler that you want. So Sensu loves the cloud and deals beautifully with ephemeral machine environments. So we added an API call to our Paperless Post dev tools so that deleting a node or silencing a node is as simple as saying, pp sensu delete node. This command can also be run from, say, from Jenkins, or theoretically even from the client node itself before being shut down and deleted. We can silence entire environments at a time using this command, which collects all of the nodes from chef and then silences them using the Sensu API. So the Sensu is really well written and easy to parse. Even for someone like me who's fairly new to Ruby, I can look at the source code and more or less understand what's going on. The Sensu community plugins repository is quite big and is constantly growing. There's over 80 contributors, over 600 plugins, and you can check it out on GitHub and see if the services that you run are covered. But if not, writing checks is really quite easy. I don't consider myself a programmer, but I've been able to contribute a handful of checks. So today at Paperless Post, we have two Sensu environments, so production and testing. Production sometimes runs 3 up to 6 instances of Sensu server, depending on the time of year, traffic, etc. We have almost 300 Sensu clients running now, and we're pushing about 25,000 metrics per hour to Graphite just through Sensu. We have one custom dashboard called HotPot, and then one custom command line interface, which I showed you, which was the PP Sensu. So all of our Sensu infrastructure is virtualized. It's all running on VMware. We're actually working on migrating some of our VMware infrastructure to OpenStack, so our testing Sensu setup is going to be on OpenStack soon. But virtual resources are fine. You don't need hardware for Sensu. We typically give a Sensu server box 1.5 gigs of RAM and 4 processors. Actually, that should just be 2 processors. You really only need 4 processors for if you have a monolithic Sensu install. So if you have Sensu and all the backing components like running on one VM, that's really the only time I would see to scale up the processors that much. So overall, our transition from Nagios to Sensu was really incredibly smooth. But as we grew, of course, there were problems here and there. So initially, we deployed a single Sensu server to handle all production, and it became obvious it was time to scale when we saw things like high load on the Sensu server and backed up queues in RabbitMQ. So one thing that's great to monitor to get some visibility into the health of your Sensu setup is the RabbitMQ ready queue size. Because if that queue gets backed up and doesn't drain, then you know you need to add some more Sensu server or Sensu resources. And I'll get a little bit more into what role RabbitMQ plays in the Sensu infrastructure. So scaling is as simple as bootstrapping or adding another Sensu server instance. In our case, we just have a chef role for Sensu server, which brings up a box running just Sensu server, no API or dashboard, and no special configuration is needed because all the Sensu components use the same configuration file. So you just start up another instance of Sensu server, and the checks will be distributed in a round-robin fashion to all the Sensu servers. The only major pain we've experienced with Sensu actually ended up being related to Graphite. Yes?
For questions, you want us to hold them or interrupt?
No, please interrupt me.
Okay. So with for scaling with the servers, are firewall rules going to get in the way? How are
we talking multi-data center stuff here, or?
Oh, I mean, talking single data center, but certainly more firewall rules than I would like.
All
sometimes.
the Sensu server would need to talk to The additional Sensu server instances would just need to talk to RabbitMQ. So you would just need to open up 5671, 5672 TCP, and I mean there may be some other ports, but that should be trivial.
Okay.
Yeah. Does anyone here run Graphite? Okay. Most of our only real Sensu pains have been related to Graphite. So we started seeing backed up queues, metric queues specifically in spotty graphs in Graphite, and we found that throwing more Sensu servers, the problem really wasn't helping. But it turns out that our Graphite cluster just couldn't keep up with the large amount of metrics we were now serving it via Sensu. So the way we're connecting Graphite to Sensu is we have Sensu pushing metrics into a special RabbitMQ queue, and then Graphite just uses AMQP to pull them down onto the Graphite server. The AMQP libraries in Graphite are not particularly performant, but we've yet to work out a better way to handle this. I think ideally the best thing would be to have some sort of middleman between Sensu and Graphite that could send through Carbon Relay. But in the end, moving our Graphite cluster to SSDs was part of the solution. The other part was to stop collecting metrics every 10 seconds with Sensu. That was just way too much. We dialed our default collection interval down to 60 seconds and moved some staging metrics to a staging Graphite cluster, and then of course moved the Graphite cluster to SSD. Okay, so how we quit Nagios in 10 easy steps. So step 1, you can pave. There's a lot of talk in the ops community about alert fatigue, and moving to a new monitoring system is really a golden opportunity to clear your slate, clean up your alerts, and determine what you really care about. And also because the differences in the way each monitoring system implements checks, it usually makes sense to just start from scratch rather than trying to port existing check configurations over to a new system. It's also a great opportunity to stop sending emails for things that don't matter. Maybe you want to see something on a dashboard but don't want to get an email every time it happens. Or maybe you just want it to be a metric and not an actual email. One example of emails we eliminated was for high load. We stopped sending emails for high memory usage and just turned those into metrics instead. Step 2 is to plan. We created a metrics and monitoring survey spreadsheet, which is displayed here and is also shared on my GitHub if you're interested. But basically, we're collecting for each type of server role, we're collecting what system checks we want to run, what process checks we want to run, what service checks do we want to run, and what metrics, system metrics and service metrics do we want to gather. The only thing that's not listed on here that if I were doing this again I would add would be the handlers. When we first deployed Sensu, we only had an email handler, but now we have different handlers for different things, like we added PagerDuty for like super critical alerts, etc. So our requirements for checks is they must be actionable. If you're sending an email for it and nobody can do anything about it, then it shouldn't be an email. It probably shouldn't even be a check. Metrics, obviously we went nuts with those. We're deploying, checking them a little too frequently, but we were able to tune that down later. So the global things, the things that we check on every single server at Paperless Post are disk usage, swap usage, we want to know if our machines are swapping, zombie processes, read-only file systems. The metrics we gather are VM stat, disk usage, CPU, memory and interface, and disk performance. And the handlers we use are email, Campfire. We have a special room set up in Campfire that's only for alerts, and then PagerDuty. And we're really only using PagerDuty for one or two things that, like really, this needs to wake someone up in the middle of the night type alerts. So step 4 is define specifics. So now that you've defined what you want to look at on every single server, let's look at each server role and define additional states to be checked and alerted on. So some examples of these, so for a process check, are there at least 4 unicorn workers running on this box, but no more than 20? System checks, let's say maybe we want to look at to see if something is mounted specifically on a certain server. Service checks, things like database connections, HTTP responses, and service metrics would be something like HA proxy, bytes in and out, RabbitMQ, queue sizes. Step 5, set up a place to test. I recommend setting up a permanent testing Sensu stack using your configuration management tool of choice. We use the Sensu Chef cookbook, which we actually hacked up and customized a lot on our own. If I were to do it over again, I would just wrap the Sensu Chef cookbook in a wrapper cookbook. How many of you guys are Chef users? Okay. How many are Puppet users? There's also good Puppet manifests for Sensu, but I haven't worked with them personally. So the testing server infrastructure will be dual purpose. One, it'll let you test your configuration management, and then it will be a good place to test things like Sensu package upgrades. Like when a new version of Sensu comes out, you want a place to test it thoroughly. So step 6, set up a workflow. Develop and document a workflow for implementing, testing, deploying, and signing off on your checks. And you'll get really good coverage if anyone, whether it be developers or ops, can easily add checks and metrics to Sensu. So an example workflow, here's how we do it in Paperless Post. So we add a new Sensu check definition to the appropriate cookbook in Chef. So we define service-specific checks within, so let's say we're setting up Nginx checks, we'll set those up in the Nginx cookbook. We'll deploy the new check to a staging environment using Chef. We actually use Jenkins to deploy our Chef recipes. Then we do a pull request in GitHub that will show the code for the Sensu check definition. We can put in sample graphs or alerts. We get a colleague to sign off on it, and then we deploy it to production. So here I'm showing you how easy it is to define a Sensu check within a Chef recipe. For the Sandbox later, we're actually not going to use Chef, but I just wanted to give an example here of how easy it is with Chef recipes. Okay, so step 7 is execute your workflow. So we started with the low-hanging fruit, which was the plugins that already existed in the community repository, and we configured and deployed each check in the worksheet and signed off on it. And then started deploying Sensu client to a few select machines. If the check didn't exist in Sensu community plugins, we could either reuse an existing Nagios check or write our own in Ruby or Bash.
What was that split like? How many plugins did you use from the community? How many did you reuse? How many did you write yourself?
I would say in the beginning we reused 2 Nagios checks, and everything else came from the community. And we probably ended up writing maybe 4 or 5 custom ones. So step 8 is to set up some sort of bare minimum third-party monitoring for the Sensu servers. This is self-explanatory. You just need something to notice if the whole Sensu system has gone down, which has not happened to us yet, but it's still good to know. We use Panopta's agent-based monitor just to check that the Sensu server machine is alive and check that the disks aren't full, and that's about it. Some other ideas, you could have your testing Sensu set up, monitor your production Sensu setup, and Sensu can collect metrics about itself, so you don't need a third party for metrics collection. Step 9, roll out your infrastructure. So you're going to have already well-tested server infrastructure from your testing deployments. And so this should go pretty smoothly because you've had a lot of practice rolling out and administering that testing setup. So first you'll stand up the Sensu server stack and then roll out Sensu client to the rest of your production servers or VMs. And step 10 is tune. The alerts will roll in and you'll likely need to tune thresholds, occurrences, etc. once you have your checks running against actual production traffic. Okay, so a little about the Sensu architecture. So Sensu uses RabbitMQ for all communications between the client and the server. And RabbitMQ and Redis are all running on the Sensu server VM on the Sandbox, and as well as the dashboard, which is not featured on here, the API and the server. And Redis is used to persist data for use by the API. Sensu package contains all of its dependencies in an omnibus installer, which means it embeds everything it needs into ops Sensu, which is really awesome because you don't have to worry about whether your system Ruby is going to conflict with it or work with it. And if you don't want to install system Ruby, then you don't have to. Okay, so if you guys are ready, we will play with the sandboxes now. Are there any questions before?
Just wondering, do you have any numbers on like the unit volume of checks that you were getting?
I don't. I mean, we have, let's say, 300 clients, about 5 to 10 checks that we run on every single server, and then, maybe 5 on top of that for each additional server role. The real load in Sensu from us comes from metrics collections. And I mean, obviously when we're having an outage or periods of high traffic, we're getting more Sensu traffic. But no, I don't have any like firm numbers on how many checks we're running overall.
Do you know the Wi-Fi password?
Yes.
Create community.
It's create space community. Okay, so our goals with the sandbox are just to get everyone familiar with the Sensu configuration. We want to install a handler, deploy a check, trigger an alert on that check, and then just in general give you something to take home and hack on. So if you mess anything up, you can just vagrant halt and vagrant up. And worst case scenario, you can destroy it and up it again. But that takes like 20 minutes to provision, so I don't recommend trying to do that right now. So the sandboxes are 2 virtual boxes, a Sensu server and a Sensu client. They were built using Vagrant and Chef. They're running CentOS 6.4 and Sensu 10.2. Since I created this tutorial, Sensu 0.12 has come out, so I apologize for not being on the cutting edge with that. I just rolled 0.12 out to production at Paperless Post, so sorry we're behind. Okay. So open up your terminal and open up an SSH session into both your server and your client VMs. And then go ahead and sudo to root just for convenience. You don't have to sudo everything. And let's take a look at the Sensu configuration. Okay, so Etsy Sensu config.json is the configuration file I was mentioning earlier that's used by all components of Sensu. So let's take a look at that. So this configuration file is saying where RabbitMQ is running. So on this setup, we're just running RabbitMQ and Redis and all the components on one VM. If you were running this in production, you might want to have a RabbitMQ separate machine or even a RabbitMQ cluster because it's pretty critical to Sensu's health and well-being. Does anyone here have any experience running RabbitMQ in a cluster? Okay, I'm going to talk to you later. Okay. So it's telling the Sensu components where Redis is, where RabbitMQ is, where the API is, and where the dashboard is. And if you look at this configuration file on your Sensu client machine, it's exactly the same. Okay, so Etsy Sensu conf.d, oops, is where the client configuration lives. So let's take a look at that. And this file is just telling Sensu the name of this client, what its address is, and what its subscriptions are. So let me talk a little bit about what subscriptions are. So there are two ways to implement checks in Sensu. You can have a standalone check, which is when a check is defined on the client machine itself. The server has no prior knowledge of that check. It's just defined on the local file system, and it tells Sensu client what to do and when to do it. There's also the pub/sub model, which is where the server tells the clients what to run and when to run them. At Paperless Post, we're doing basically a combination of the two, but most of our checks are standalone. So today we're going to be using subscription-based checks. So we're going to configure the checks on the server, and the server will tell the client to execute them and publish the results. Okay, and then the other parts of Etsy Sensu are pretty self-explanatory. You have a folder for extensions, handlers, mutators, and plugins, and then the SSL configuration. So let's look in plugins. And these are the ones I've already installed. They're all Ruby. They all came from the Sensu Community Plugins repository. So you can take a look through those if you want. Let's see, handlers. We have no handlers, so that's one of the first things we're going to need to configure. Okay, so let's trigger our first alert on your Sensu client. Well, first let's open up the dashboard. Well, we can get to that in a second. Go ahead and stop the Sensu client on the Sensu client VM. And that will take 120 seconds before it raises the keep alive alert on the server. That interval is tunable, but the default is 120 seconds. So if your Vagrant provisioned correctly, this should be the IP and the username and password for your Sensu dashboard. I was having some Vagrant problems earlier, and my dashboard is actually running at 192.168.1.10. But you can see I have two clients, the Sensu client and Sensu server. And no events found. We should have seen a keep alive alert here. But we can check back a little bit. Okay, so what is a handler? A handler is something that takes action on an event using a pipe, TCP, UDP, AMQP, or it can be a set of other handlers. Examples are send an email, send an event to PagerDuty, send metrics to Graphite, make a custom API call, whatever you can write, you can do. The default handler is debug, which means it just writes the event to the log and displays it on the dashboard. So a very basic handler example would be send an email, and then an advanced handler would be a handler that actually attempts to remediate an alert. So let's say run a custom script that spins up additional EC2 instances when it sees high load on a specific service. So today we're going to configure an email handler that will send an informative email for an event. So I've already installed the mailer plugin for you. That was in Etsy Sensu Handlers. So now we just need to configure it and install it. So on your Sensu server machine, if you'll open up Etsy Sensu comp.d handlers mailer.json, and I'll pull that up on my screen. So this is just a JSON file where we're going to tell it where the email should be from and where they should go to. So this is a really simple handler script. Like it can't inherently change who it sends to based on attributes or anything, but if you wanted to write something that did that, it should be fairly easy. Close that out, and then we're going to actually configure the handler. So if you'll copy this Etsy Sensu comp.d handlers default.json to email.json, and then we're going to edit that file. Normally you would be hand editing JSON files, your Chef or Puppet or whatever, your configuration management would be doing this for you. So if it seems a little painful, I just didn't want to use Chef to do all this because I didn't want people to think that Chef was the only option for setting up Sensu. So now we're going to edit this email.json. And we want it to look like this. So we're just telling it the type of handler is a pipe, and the command to be run is Sensu handlers mailer.rb. Can't really see what I'm doing here, so okay, so part of installing Sensu plugin is, or plugins and handlers both, is making sure the gem dependencies are met. This handler in particular depends on the mail gem. So you can check to see if that gem is installed in the Sensu embedded Ruby using this command, but I've already installed it for you. So because we're working as root, you'll want to fix permissions. And then restart the services. So we're going to start Sensu server restart, and then we're going to look at the Sensu server log and grep for mail. And hopefully I didn't make any mistakes in my JSON. Okay, so I messed up the JSON in email.json. So let me see if I can fix that. Okay, so that's what we wanted. It says config file, applied changes. We've added a handler for our email. Okay, so checks. Sensu client runs checks that are defined or scheduled either locally, which is the standalone that I mentioned earlier, or defined in the Sensu server, which is the subscription. And it checks Sensu results as an event to a handler, and this applies to anything, whether it's service checks or metrics. And the check execution is scheduled by the server or scheduled by the client, and today we're going to do a subscription-based check on the server that will run on our client. So let's configure a check. We're going to use checkprocs.rb to make sure that at least one instance of cornbread is running. So to determine, the first thing I would do when developing a check is determine what the check command is going to be. So on your Sensu client, we're going to test out this command. So we'll call the plugin using the Sensu embedded Ruby, and then I'll show you check procs with no. So it actually doesn't print out usage. We should probably fix that. Yeah, the help isn't very descriptive. But basically we're telling it -P is what pattern to grep for, and then the capital W1 is saying we want at least, warn us if there's not at least one cornbread process running. So let's test that command, and we get a warning because there are no processes matching cornbread. Okay, so we're going to save that command. And we're going to install the check. So going back to the Sensu server, let's open up Etsy Sensu comp.d checks cornbread process.json. I'm going to cheat and paste this in. Hoping for it to be pretty colored for you guys. But. Okay, so let's walk through what each part of this check configuration means. So cornbread process is the name of the check. The handlers are the email that we set up. If we wanted to make this a set of handlers, we would just add something like PagerDuty here. Of course, that would fail because we don't have PagerDuty defined, but a check can have as many handlers as you want it to have. The notification is just, something descriptive. We're out of cornbread. Command is the command we just tested. The subscribers are all. Basically, I've added the client to a subscription group called all, which you saw in the client's config.json. We want it to run every 60 seconds, and we want it to alert after one occurrence. And then with butter, it's true because cornbread is always better with butter. And I just wanted to show that you can put any arbitrary key value pair in the Sensu config that can be used by the Sensu plugins and handlers.
So is there any sort of convention with the file, does the check have to be named the same file name?
No, you could actually name it zzz.json.
Can you put multiple checks in one file?
Yes, yes, you can. Okay, so we defined the check, and now we're going to restart the Sensu server. Actually, we could have just reloaded, but. And now let's look at the log file for any errors. And what you're seeing coming by right now is a RabbitMQ, some Redis metrics that were set up automatically by one of the cookbooks I used. So they're kind of cluttering the log, so I might just grep for cornbread. I don't think that check got loaded. Okay, yeah, so the config file did get loaded. Let's go and see. Let's check the dashboard and see if we've gotten an alert. Okay, so we've gotten our Keep Alive alert from our Sensu client showed up because I forgot to tell you guys to restart Sensu client on the Sensu client VM. So if you want to do that to see your cornbread alert, we can go back to Sensu client and start it back up. So now Sensu client will start up and so now we're seeing the check request come in from the server. The server is saying, run this particular command and send me the results. So we didn't have to make any of the client side, that was all defined on the server side. So now let's see if we got an email. We did not, but I think I may have set up the wrong email address. But in theory, you should have gotten an email also showing that there are no processes matching cornbread. And this is what the email looks like. It's really simple. It just says what host the alert came in on, the timestamp, the address of the client question, the check name, the command that was run, and how many times has it occurred. So let's talk a little bit about the Sensu API. So the Sensu has a REST API. It runs on HTTP 4567. On your Sensu server, you can try curling events, and you'll get a list of all the current events. You can pipe it to the Python JSON tool to make it look a little prettier. Let's try this. So now we have another view into our current Sensu events. It's good to not have to depend completely on one dashboard and to have other interfaces into what's going on with your monitoring. So the Sensu services are the Sensu API, which we just queried, the Sensu server, which is what actually issues and processes, issues the checks, processes the check results, and basically, shuffles data between the Sensu client and the Sensu server, and then the Sensu dashboard. So how do you check if everything is okay? It's all initd based. You can just do Sensu service, blah, start, stop, status, restart. All the logs are in log Sensu, and you can curl the API. There's an info endpoint, which will give you useful information, and that you could even use for a custom check if you wanted. Let's take a look at that. So it's saying RabbitMQ is connected. We have at least one consumer of the Keep Alive queue. We have at least one consumer of the results queue. And Redis is connected, and the Sensu version is 0.10.2.
I have a question about when you set the check, did it
I can't, I'm sorry, I can't hear, there's like a fan running back there. I'm gonna walk over here.
So when you set up a check,
Uh-huh.
how do the clients synchronize that check? Is it like something that happens periodically, or like overall?
They're pulling they subscribe to a specific channel on RabbitMQ, in which the server sends it instructions. That's if you're using the pub/sub model. If you're using the standalone model, then the checks are all defined locally on the file system on that client.
So what if you make a check and like your server agent is offline and this is that message? Does that happen, or is it?
The Sensu client, if the
Yeah.
Sensu client is dead, then nothing's gonna happen.
So like, what if like all your boxes are offline and you set up all your checks? How do the clients when they come online, how do they get their checks for the first time?
Because they connect to RabbitMQ, and based on their subscription list, they know which channel in RabbitMQ to join and to listen for the checks.
Okay.
Yeah. And if a machine comes online, it starts up Sensu client for the first time, it registers itself with Sensu server. And if it subsequently stops sending people lives, you're going to get an alert. So even if you meant for that machine to be down, you either need to delete it in Sensu client or assume that the Sensu client has died. Okay, so some cool Sensu tricks. You can send events directly to Sensu using Netcat. So Sensu listens on 3030, Sensu client that is. So you can do this on any of your client machines. You can just echo a JSON event directly to 3030 and it should show up on your dashboard. I tried to demo this live before and it didn't work, but we'll try it anyway. Okay, so Sensu is listening. Let's try sending something to it. Oh, fail. I haven't installed Netcat. Sorry. But it works, I promise. Okay. Aggregate alerts. Aggregates are really awesome for preventing alert floods. So one use case for it is we have, let's say we have 20 web app servers and we don't want 20 alerts if HTTP goes down on all of them. Maybe we only want one alert when over 50% of them are down. Some other Sensu personal tips for me, install the RabbitMQ management web interface and bookmark it. Let me give you a quick view of that. Whenever I think something might be wrong with Sensu, this is usually the first place I go. This is an older version of RabbitMQ. The newer dashboard is a little nicer, but this is the big thing we care about, this ready queue. If you've got 10,000 messages sitting in your ready queue and it's not draining, then something is wrong with your Sensu setup. It's also just kind of fun to like poke around and see what kind of queues and connections Sensu creates. Another thing I recommend is locking your plugin's gem dependency versions. So if you write a plugin and let's say it depends on the Redis gem, in your configuration management recipes, so like in our chef recipes, I specify the exact version of that Redis gem to install because I've gotten bitten before with just the latest gem being installed and not working with my Sensu plugins. So some more tips, have alternative ways to access your dashboard information. I showed you the API. That's like, you can, if you are a developer, you can take that and run with it. We've integrated our command line tools with Sensu API, and we've also created our own ops dashboard that queries Sensu Graphite and our app for data. It's called HotPot. I haven't pulled it up for you, but if anyone's interested afterwards, I can show you. Another tip is to put Nginx in front of Sensu Dashboard. Sensu Dashboard runs on a weird port and asks you to log in every time. So if you're running it behind, if you're inside your data center and you're not worried about security, you're not worried about whoever logging in, we just pass through authentication using Nginx. How do you make Sensu highly available? Redundancy is really easy. You just bring in more Sensu servers. But making Redis and RabbitMQ highly available can be more challenging, and there's not really, I haven't found any documentation or recommended best practices within the Sensu community for doing so specifically for Sensu. So at Paperless, we're still running one solitary Redis and one solitary RabbitMQ, but we're actually okay with this for now because it doesn't take us long. In an emergency, it wouldn't take us long to bring up a new instance of that because we're using Chef. So where do you go for help? There's docs.sensuapp.org, which are quite good. The absolute best place to get help I found is the Sensu channel on Freenode. I try to hang out there and contribute back as much as I can. And then there's the Sensu users mailing list. And that's it. Do y'all have any questions? Sure.
Do you use this to check anything that can't run the client, like network code or anything like that?
I'm using it to pull, just do really simple like ping checks on a couple like VPN endpoints and devices, but I haven't gotten as far as doing any like SNMP checks, but people have done it. We're just not doing it in paperless yet.
What about like dependency handling? So like if something in your architecture goes down, it's going to stop.
I'm not personally doing it, but it is possible with Sensu. I wasn't aware of it until recently, but apparently there is some dependency handling.
So I saw that you can output metrics from Sensu into Graphite. Is there also stuff to alert on, like let's say your stats feed is going into Graphite? Is there stuff to check for things like that?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes, there is. We're using that more and more frequently. We have a plugin that pulls JSON out of Graphite, looks at a value, and alerts on it based on the key.
Is that something you had to write yourself, or is that something
If it is, I will be very soon asking my colleague to do a pull request and publish it to Sensu Community Plugins. But I believe there's already a check Graphite JSON plugin. But if you don't see it out there, or if I don't see it, we would gladly share ours.
Do you use, kind of off question, do you use Graphite or do you use prettier front end?
We use a front end called Graffiti that we wrote at Paperless Post.
We also
If you ever mention that you open source it, you could also use it.
Yeah, Graffiti is open source, so you can check that out.
You wrote the chapter cookbooks.
Sean Porter, the person who wrote Sensu, wrote the chef cookbooks for Sensu.
You say you were running multiple Sensu servers before. Was that mostly because you also use Sensu to do your routing for metrics collection?
Yeah, I'm not sure we would need quite that many Sensu servers if we were only using it for monitoring.
Sensu server receive the metric and then pass that along to Graphite?
Yeah, it's basically just routing the metric to Graphite for us.
Is it possible to like do any sort of normalization or cleanup like in Sensu?
Yes, you can use mutators,
Okay.
and a mutator could take anything and mutate it any way you want and then pass it on. All right, well, if you guys think of any other questions, you can reach me at Bethany@payrolls.com. I'm SkyMob on Twitter, and I'm Robot with a Rose on